Recently I watched a video that was a presentation of a discussion between some Christian pastors and some atheists. The atheists were actually leaders, some of them, a couple of them, pretty well known, and they were trying to have a cordial conversation amongst themselves about the things that perhaps are misunderstandings between atheists and Christians. They were asking questions of one another that they thought were common questions or things that people would like to know about. And one of the issues, in fact one of the very first issues that came up in the discussion was the atheists lamented the fact or complained about the fact that Christians often think, or people who believe in God, often think that atheists can't be moral people. And they were very concerned about that. And I've discovered in my own discussions with atheists through the years that it's an especially raw point or sensitive nerve when you bring up morality. Atheists tend to respond very negatively to the very suggestion that they don't have the moral resources or the foundations for moral life that a Christian or one who believes in God might have. And the discussion, I thought, was interesting, and it proceeded based on, first of all, the idea that the atheists say we can be moral people. And then the Christians responded by affirming atheists can be moral people. But then the discussion took, I thought, a rather bizarre turn. After there was an agreement that atheists could do moral things or could act in moral ways, the atheists proceeded to defend a kind of radical moral relativism. That ultimately morality is what we like and what we choose to do, and that there is no objective standpoint from which to determine moral principles or moral rules, which of course means that it devolves into a relativistic situation where what one person thinks is good, another person might think is bad. And I thought that's exactly the point that Christians have been trying to make, is that without some kind of objective or supreme standpoint to determine what is ultimately good or to give to us some type of guidance into what is good, we don't have a clear moral orientation. In addressing this, I'd just like to make a couple of points. I know that making quick points is a rather dangerous thing, but hopefully it will be enough maybe to get a conversation started in your own mind or among those that you know. The first point that I would like to make is there's a distinction that should be made between acting morally or doing a morally good thing, and secondly, moral theory or the foundations of moral life. A person could know what is good or right to do, but not do it. On the other hand, a person simply may not know what the right thing to do is, or they may not have the resources to give them moral guidance or to know what they should do or shouldn't do. Those are two very different situations, to know what is good and not do it versus not knowing what is right or what is good. So the question then is, what is morally good? Where do I get my direction, or where do I get my guidance about what is morally good? What concerns me about contemporary atheism, especially the more popular kinds of atheism that we find, what usually goes under the name of the new atheism. What concerns me is that many of these that are associated with this contemporary effort to defend atheism, and really to rather forcefully attack the belief in God, is that their greatest defenders seem to be undermining any real basis for morality, and some of them see that more clearly than others do. I'm holding in my hand a book, for example, by Sam Harris called Free Will. Sam Harris being one of the leaders of the contemporary New Atheism movement, and throughout his book, it's a rather short book and I encourage you to read it, throughout his book he sort of systematically attacks any kind of objective morality at all, or I should say any kind of freedom. And freedom has traditionally been understood, and I think very, sort of effectively argued as an essential precondition for morality. If there's no such thing as genuine freedom, then how can you hold anyone accountable for what they do? How can a person be responsible for not doing something when there is no freedom to act otherwise? And Sam Harris clearly in his book over and again argues that determinism, that is, what happens has to happen, So that if a person murders someone, and he starts his book with an illustration of that, of a horrible murder, a real case of murder, but then goes on to argue for all the physical underlying causes of the murder, and concludes with the idea that you simply could not have expected the person to have done otherwise. And so then the case becomes, or the question becomes, if people can't help but do what they do because physical causes are the reason why they do them, then the question is, what does responsibility mean? What is moral accountability? Could people have done differently than they did? And I think the answer clearly is no. You see the same thing in Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, his recent sort of defense of atheism from a scientific standpoint. In that book, he clearly argues that even though it's very subtle, and even though it requires a level of knowledge of causes that is beyond perhaps our competence, it is the case that everything that happens, including those things that we think are free, are really nothing more than having to do what matter causes us to do. This, I think, highlights the concern that the Christian has, that if there is no God, there is no supreme source, number one, of freedom, because all that exists is matter in motion. All there is material causal relationships. And if there's nothing but material causal relationships, and everything that I do is caused by them, then it becomes meaningless to talk about freedom or about responsibility for my actions, because I couldn't have done otherwise anyway. And not only does my freedom evaporate, but also any kind of objective, overlying sort of standard or basis of orienting ourselves in respect to our moral actions disappears. Now, often atheists, one quick point here to conclude on this idea, often atheists will say, well, where do we get this information from God? Well, there are plenty of philosophical systems, like what you find in Aristotle, for example, or St. Thomas Aquinas in his natural theology. The idea that there's an ultimate good that we're striving after, and that human nature has a sort of trajectory or tendency toward achieving the good of creatures that is sort of built into the nature of things, that nature itself moves toward resemblance to the supreme good, namely to God. Because nature moves in that way, we can use reason and we can use the gift of freedom to orient ourselves toward our highest good. I don't have to quote from the Bible or some other religious book in order to make that point. So it's not the case that we say either the Bible or you have to be immoral. We can reason about our moral life, but the reasoning that we use at some point involves some kind of objective, ultimate sort of goal that we're trying to reach toward or strive toward that has some objectively good status. And so there are, of course, many atheists who do moral things. The problem, I think, is that they don't have sufficient rational justification for those moral actions. So that if that becomes the standard of a civilization, of its moral principles, I don't think atheism, in fact, I'm confident that atheism does not have the resources or the philosophical resources, the sources in human reason, to ultimately undergird or support a true morality that can allow us to thrive and to flourish as a civilization and as a people.